glasses, no glasses.
A very pleasant good afternoon to all of our viewers. We want to take the opportunity to welcome you to our Let's Talk for today, being the 22nd of April, 2023. We have been having a very exciting time sharing on the non-communicable of diseases, 2023. And today we continue that series. We are, in fact, going to be talking about heart disease. We have a competent panel who will guide us in this process as we discuss the various subjects that we have covered for the last few weeks have generated quite a number of discussion. The interest has been very good. I have been getting input from all around the world, individuals just sharing how meaningful the program has been to them. Before we introduce our guests, however, we are going to invite you to bow your heads forward. Great. Father, be with us as we share on this afternoon's Let's Talk. We pray for your wisdom and your guidance in Jesus' name. Amen. So, friends, we have been for the last 4 weeks dealing with, today makes week 4. We have been talking about non-communicable diseases and the Christian's response. We as Christians like to say that we are made in the image of God, our bodies belong to him, and we ought to take good care of it. And the concern over NCDs is a serious concern. And so we have on Let's Talk taken the time to address some issues because we do have a crisis. This afternoon, we have our regular panelists with us in the person of Charity Dublin, who is our nutritionist. We are delighted to have Charity. I have been getting so many, reactions, and people are just telling me, oh, I love this lady. I love this lady. She makes things so simple. So it's good to have you back again. Welcome.
Lovely to be here. Thank you.
We also have Dr. Monica Stevens. Dr. Stevens, as usual, always a joy to have you on Let's Talk. Welcome and good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks again for having me, Dr. Greene. Looking forward to another great discussion.
And our special guest for this afternoon is Dr. Mead. Dr. Mead is a cardiologist and internal medicine specialist. We are so delighted that she has chosen to join us on our Let's Talk program for today. We are happy to have her expertise, and she is going to be, because we're talking about heart disease this afternoon, Dr. Mead is going to be the one who will speak to issues of, how challenging that is, the complications that can arise as a result of that. And so I just want to share with our friends briefly, we won't go into much details, but Dr. Stevens, I'm saying Dr. Stevens, sorry, Dr. Mead is, as I indicated, a cardiologist. She was trained in the Caribbean and in North America and Canada. She works in Antigua. We're delighted to have her with us. Dr. Mead, welcome to Let's Talk and good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greene. It's my pleasure to be here today.
It's a delight to have you with us. At this time, we want to just go straight into our discussion. We have been talking on this program for the last, as I mentioned, from the beginning of April. We have been talking about non-communicable diseases. We have looked at diabetes, we have looked at hypertension, we have looked at issues relating to the kidney. Last week, we looked at the issue of obesity. And today we want to talk about heart disease. So I want to begin by asking, perhaps Dr. Mead, you can respond to this one. What exactly is heart disease? When we say heart disease, what are we talking about?
Right, so we all have a heart and only one. So I'm happy that you're highlighting this topic today, because we have to do everything we can to prevent these diseases. And if they're established, try to keep them under control, so that we could live longer, healthier lives. And so heart disease, whenever I'm discussing this, I usually use a house as a concept that most people can follow what I'm saying. So the muscle is like the structure of the building. So the muscle is the main structure of the heart, and it's made up of cardiac cells. Then there's swinging doors. So the valves are similar to what we call swinging doors. So they open and close, allowing blood from the upper chamber to the lower chamber, and from the lower chamber out to the rest of the body. Then, just like having the electrical connections in the home, the heart has a similar concept. And so when there's disease of this area, the patient may have a slow heartbeat or fast heartbeat. And the fast we refer to an arrhythmia. And then when it's extremely slow, sometimes a pacemaker is required. So some persons may have heard about a pacemaker. Then the plumbing, heart attack. So whenever there's an issue with the arteries that take blood with oxygen to the heart muscle, patients can develop, the most common heart disease is heart attack. And why does this happen? So if you think about sediments laying down in the plumbing, in your home, in the pipes, there's like cholesterol deposits or fat deposits laying down in the arteries, and it obstructs the blood flow. So whenever it's mild, patients may have chest pain if they exert themselves, and we call that angina. And once they rest, the pain goes away. So that's the stable type. But sometimes it doesn't respond to relaxing or resting, and that's unstable angina. But worst case scenario, if there's a significant blockage for an extended period of time, you could develop what we call a heart attack, because the muscles of the heart are not getting the oxygenated blood that it requires. So that's trying to simplify it. So these are acquired conditions. And then there's the congenital type, meaning these are developmental changes. So while in the womb, there are changes in terms of the development of the heart. And locally, most common, we may refer to it as a hole in the heart. So the connections between the muscles, there's a hole. So the blood from the right side of the heart can flow over to the left and vice versa. So that shouldn't happen. And so some persons develop disease of the heart because of that. But that one is out of their control. We call that a congenital heart defect. So I try to simplify it as much as I can. And that's an overview of heart disease.
So effectively, when we say heart disease, we are speaking about, if I gather your summation there, a few things. We're talking about the heart. Well, you mentioned congenital heart diseases as what, in my words, I'd probably say that is a internal problem of the heart itself. But we're also talking about issues relating to bad plumbing, because of the things that we take into our bodies, that they create obstruction to the blood flow, and hence impact the functionality of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to ask another question. I'm not sure who will respond to this one. Dr. Stevens, you are, I was going to say, well, a family doctor. So perhaps, you in your capacity, you may need to make referrals to Dr. Mead and others as you see them. But this question really is, we have noted last week, the week before, the previous week, that obesity and hypertension and diabetes are all very common in our parts of the world. They all seem to be on the increase. When we talk about heart disease, is this a similar thing? Are we in these parts, in the Caribbean area, seeing an increase in heart disease? It seems as if everybody's waiting on somebody else to answer.
Dr. Mead, you see more heart diseases. You want to take this one?
All right. Unfortunately, Dr. Greene, we are seeing a significant increase, and heart disease is already the #1 cause of death in Antigua and Barbuda and globally. So up to 18 million persons lose their lives because of heart disease. And I'm happy you're doing this show today because it then highlights it. What can we do to prevent this from happening? And up to 80 to 90% of heart disease are preventable. So there's a lot we can do personally to prevent this trajectory, prevent ourselves from being a part of this statistic. And it starts at all levels, from the children to the adults, the elderly persons, and all stakeholders, not only the government. A lot of it we have to do ourselves. But unfortunately, yes, heart disease is on the rise. And to continue from what I was discussing, heart failure is the end product of all those conditions I was mentioning earlier. If they're not adequately managed, not identified, it can lead to what we call heart failure. And the heart's job is, the heart is the pump for the body to pump blood with oxygen to the rest of the body. And whenever it's unable to do this, the condition called congestive heart failure develops. And that's the definition of what heart failure means. And, my patients, when I use the term heart failure, they get a bit, depressed or sad. But I quickly will let them know it can be controlled, it can be improved, and they could still have a healthy life as much as possible. But we want to be aggressive in terms of treatment and avoiding the risk factors. So yes is the answer to your initial question.
Oh, so you mentioned there, Dr. Mead, that I'm so stunned by what you said, but you indicated that it is the #1 cause of death, not just in the world, but in Antigua likewise. Now that is concerning. And then you said that it is preventable. 90% is preventable. And I noted that you mentioned as we take a collective response, you're talking about youth, children, etc., which suggests, and from my knowledge, the things that we discussed last week, in fact, all those diseases that we spoke about so far, whether it be diabetes, hypertension, whether it be obesity, they can all lead to heart disease in one way or the other. So we're talking about a lot of interconnectedness here. Before we go into the whole concept of the prevention, how do people get heart disease? Apart from an individual, I've heard of people who are born with some defects in the heart. But outside of that, how do I move from a healthy person to getting heart disease?
Okay, I'm going to answer this question. So, Pastor, we cannot get away from the lifestyle habits. Dr. Mead spoke about heart disease in general, and then pointed out that basically there's some heart diseases we are born with, and there's some that we acquire. Now, the ones that we are born with, those that are called congenital heart diseases, there's nothing we can do about it. As Dr. Mead rightly said, that happens in utero when the baby is in the mother's womb. But the ones that are acquired, those ones are largely due to our lifestyle, what we eat, if we exercise, if we drink alcohol, if we smoke. The unhealthy diet, we have spoken about that for the last 3 weeks, the unhealthy fats, the saturated fats that we get from our red meat, such as our pork, our lamb, and our beef. Those increase heart diseases. Then we have the sugars, high sugars and carbohydrates. They add as well to increasing the risk of heart diseases. Smoking. What smoking does, I know we don't smoke as a people in terms of Seventh-day Adventists, but it's so important to note that studies have shown over and over again that smoking hardens the arteries, and it also increases the bad cholesterol, the LDL. Then we have alcohol intake, alcohol as well hardens. Dr. Mead spoke about the plumbing of the heart. It also hardens the arteries. It actually increases weight gain. And all of these lead to high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. And the sum of all of those also contribute to heart disease?
So again, we are talking about the need to be responsible as individuals. Now, I think that sometimes people do not really understand how challenging it can be to have certain kinds of health conditions. You know, some people think that, okay, I'm going to get sick, I'll go to the doctor and I'll get some tablets and or some medication and I'll get better. Can you give us an idea, Dr. Mead, just an idea, just to provide some reality check of the impact on the quality of life for a person who is seriously affected with heart disease? What kind of changes do they have to make? What kind of limitations do they experience? And depending on the severity of the disease, what is their recovery chances?
Yeah, so I'll identify one of those conditions I mentioned. So example, a heart attack. So if someone, there's different severity, and not everyone dies from a heart attack, or most people don't, because I found that may be a misconception from interacting with patients over time. So you can recover from a heart attack, but then there are limitations. If it's significant to the point of damaging the muscles of the heart, as I mentioned, it can lead to heart failure. So that's one. If you develop heart failure, and then there's stages of heart failure again, there's retention of fluid, you might be short of breath, you won't be able to lay down comfortably and sleep. Some persons have to sleep in a reclining chair, and they can't get to the washroom unassisted. This is the severe cases. You're unable to work, your daughter might be getting married and you're unable to get to the wedding. So there's the matter of sexual intercourse. There's a period of where you cannot, and exercise even comfortably. So there's lifestyle changes, or what we may consider our daily activities, that are affected from if you have a severe heart attack. The good thing is, by and large, most people don't have the severe type. You may have gotten one medication for hypertension, you did not take it. Now you're having several medications that you need to take. So, when there's complaints about taking the one, keep the pressure under control, exercise, watching the salt intake, just to manage the hypertension. I usually encourage, if you don't, then there's other complications that can develop, which then require more frequent visits to the doctor, hospital admissions, and more medications, because now there are other complications that we're now trying to manage and prevent from worsening.
So it's interesting that if I have hypertension and I'm careless with managing my hypertension, that is going to lead to something else and puts me in a worse condition. So if I go to a nutritionist now, when people come to you as a nutritionist and you develop a meal plan, well, I don't know if I'm saying the right thing, so correct me here, but I'm going to go ahead and say it. You develop a meal plan, you tell them this is how you're supposed to be eating. You shared, for example, how a plate should look. I still have that picture of the plate in my mind. Do you find that people are readily willing to comply? Is it a struggle? Are people, unless maybe, I don't know. Some people wait until they're very, very sick to get help. And I suppose if you're very, very sick and the doctor tells you this is what you need to do, you're going to do it. But are people readily compliant?
Excellent question. And it depends on the person, because we know and we acknowledge that persons are in different stages of readiness for change. So we want to meet persons where they are. So I can't tell you whether persons are readily compliant or not, because there's some weeks when you see patients and everyone is right on the ball. And then there are others where persons are struggling with making change, because one thing that we do acknowledge is that making change is hard. Some persons may be just thinking about the concept, they may be so overwhelmed. Other persons may not have the family or social support in place to make the change. Others may not have the literacy or the numeracy, their ability to understand what it is that we are encouraging. Some persons don't have the finances, because I believe last week or the week before we'd have mentioned that healthy eating is in fact expensive, and it's just the truth that we cannot avoid. So I don't think it's necessarily that some people just aren't ready, willing, or able to change. That is true, yes. But I think most persons are in a different places when it comes to accepting their condition, accepting the need to change, and deciding what they want to do. So I think as healthcare professionals, what we try to do is we try to meet them where they are. So I personally, let me speak for myself, I never force a specific plan of action onto a patient. What I do is I sit down, I talk with them, I understand what's going on in their life, where they are. We go through what their intake looks like, and then from there we decide what can we do. What 4 or 5 steps can we take in order to make a difference? After you've made those steps, you're going to work on them, then you'll come back to me. We'll see what worked, what didn't. If you weren't able to make any of the changes, we try to analyze and figure out why that is and how we can adjust. So it's not necessarily that persons aren't ready to change. I think it's very few who aren't ready at all, but some persons just aren't in that space for whatever reason. So we address that person as an individual and then move from there.
I want to ask you another question, because, as a child growing up, and this has to do with the significance of cultural impact or tradition, you may say. The way I was oriented in terms of eating, I saw my parent, my siblings, etc. We had breakfast, but the breakfast was not so significant. The lunch and the supper were the things, and that very big meal for the day was that last meal of the day. And you may be getting a big ball of fungi with some maybe squash and the side, or you have that very high carbohydrate diet with maybe significant portions of protein and very little vegetables as well. And you go into it and you tell yourself, this is how you ought to eat. Now, in my day growing up as a child, I never heard about the need to be getting advice from a nutritionist. I get sick, I go to the doctor. If my doctor tells me I need to see a nutritionist, that would sound very strange to me. So is it difficult orienting people to understanding that, diet is significant? You may not have been exposed correctly, and you need to change, you need to redirect.
Yes, yes, it is. Because just last week, I had a client who was referred, and usually I ask clients, why are you here to see me? And their response is most often the doctor sent me. And so when I go through, if they're not quite sure of the reason, we'll go through the referral note or we'll go through their charts. And I said, I think you're here to see me. For this client, I said, I believe you're here to see me for your diabetes and hypertension management. And she said, oh, you do that? I thought the doctor sent me here to lose weight. So it's that persons don't necessarily understand the role of a nutritionist dietitian. And some persons just simply think as food, it's a common saying, like food is fuel. And they don't understand the intricacies surrounding that, because it's not that food is fuel only. Food plays so many other roles in whether it is our social or psychological selves, as well as our overall general health. Yes, definitely. But there are other intricacies there. So for example, we'd have discussed fats in the previous weeks. It's not just that you're cutting down the amount of fat that you're consuming, but we need to look at the type of fat and ensuring that we're getting the correct balance there. So I think, yes, most persons need to be aware of what a nutritionist is and what they do and the role that they play in managing health overall, because there are a lot of intricacies that take place there.
Well, let's now, my next question is perhaps going to go into some of those intricacies. Again, I don't know which one of you will respond to this, but when we look at risk factors of heart disease, we think of things like high blood pressure. I mentioned obesity, and Dr. Stevens mentioned smoking, lack of exercise, and high cholesterol. Now, we already dealt with things like hypertension, diabetes, obesity. But can we talk about cholesterol a bit? I believe it's a word that is very common, but how much we understand it, I'm not so sure. So what is cholesterol and how does it affect us and where does it come from?
Okay, I'll answer that question. Cholesterol is basically a waxy, fatty substance that is in the body, and it comes from two main sources. First of all, your liver makes it. And basically the liver makes all the cholesterol that you need. And so if you never put cholesterol within your body from outside, you will still function normally. But the second source is from animal sources. So when you eat whatever type of meats you eat, your body will get cholesterol from that. And when persons think about cholesterol, they initially get afraid and they think that cholesterol is all bad, but it's really not, because cholesterol is needed for all of our cell structure, the cell membrane. You need cholesterol to build those cell membranes. And cholesterol also is important making different type of vitamins and different hormones. But it's when you intake too much cholesterol, that's the problem.
So that's interesting. Our bodies make the cholesterol, and when we take in too much additional one, then it creates a challenge. Now, I've heard of LDL and HDL. Can you explain what is the difference? One is supposed to be good, one is supposed to be bad. What is what?
Okay, so, okay, go ahead, Doc.
All right, so the LDL, that's the one that's referred to as the bad cholesterol. It's low density lipoprotein. And the HDL is broken down, it's high density lipoprotein. So they both transport cholesterol. Now, the HDL takes away the bad cholesterol or cholesterol from within the bloodstream. And so that's why it's considered to be the good one. Whereas the LDL takes the cholesterol, it's deposited in the arteries. And this is where the risk of heart attacks come in and the risk of strokes. And so that's why the LDL is considered the bad cholesterol. But they're really acting as transport systems.
So can we expand on that a little bit? Now, I think Dr. Stevens mentioned that if I take too much cholesterol in my body, then it's going to create a problem. And Dr. Mead, you're saying that the bad cholesterol is deposited in the bloodstream. I'm assuming it creates
the arteries.
It helps
the arteries, the arteries
and
the brain and
the
arteries too.
Yeah. And so it helps to create that plaque buildup that is in the body and interferes with the blood flow. So that can be a little dangerous. If that is the case, how do I know? I don't know if our nutritionist wants to respond to this one, but how do I know what has good cholesterol and what has bad cholesterol?
All right, that's a fantastic question. What we want to do overall is Dr. Stevens mentioned reducing our intake of cholesterol foods. So that's the first thing that we want to do, because that total cholesterol will impact your blood cholesterol. So here we're talking about things like whole milk and animal source. So basically animal source foods are going to be impacting our overall cholesterol. We also want to pay attention to saturated fats, which are primarily coming from animal source foods, and also tropical oils like coconut oil or palm kernel oil. We know that saturated fats and trans fats, which are going to be primarily found. So there's some that's naturally occurring in things like beef, goats, sheep, as well as fried food. However, a lot of it is coming from our packaged foods, our processed meat, our snack foods, our pastries, cakes, cookies. We're getting some trans fats there. And these are going to cause an increase in our bad cholesterol. Alternatively, how we can increase, so what we want to do is we want to reduce our bad cholesterol cholesterol, the LDL, and we want to increase our good cholesterol. So we reduce our bad cholesterol by staying away from foods, animal source foods, going into a more plant-based diet. I shouldn't say staying away, I should say reducing. We don't need to completely avoid it, trending towards more plant-based diets. We also want to reduce our intake of saturated and trans fats. Alternatively, when it comes to increasing our good cholesterol, we want to ensure that we are intaking foods that are healthy that are high in our healthy fats. So here we are talking about the unsaturated fats, omega-3s. We're also talking about our avocado, pear, our nuts, our fish. So when I say fish, we can do salmon, we can do sardines, we can do tuna. Those are all fine. We can also want to trend more towards our plant-based oils, our plant fats. Canola and olive are usually my recommendations for vegetable oils. So that's how we adjust our HDL and our LDL, one way in which we can do so. So we want to reduce our intake of saturated fats and trans fats, and we want to increase our omega-3s and our unsaturated fats.
Now, some persons are listening and they may be wondering, you're mentioning things like saturated fats, unsaturated fats, and they may be asking, how in the world do I know what you're talking about? Let me just add, because I understand that maybe I should just stay there. Yeah, go ahead. So can any of you help those persons who don't quite understand what we mean by saturated fats, what we're talking about?
So saturated fats are primarily going to be coming from those from those animal source foods, and they're going to be a solid at room temperature. So think about butter. Butter is solid at room temperature versus an unsaturated fat, which is primarily going to be liquid at room temperature. So we can think about olive oil. A great example is coconut oil. We know that the Caribbean is warm, yes, but I'm sure that on some cold nights, if you leave out your coconut oil, even if you put your coconut oil in the refrigerator, we'd see that it becomes solid. So it is in fact a saturated fat. So that's one way in which we can tell the difference.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, some persons, Dr. Mead, Dr. Stevens, I don't know, some persons, Ms. Dublin, some persons debate coconut fats. Coconut is unique in that it is not an animal product, but it has very high levels of saturated fat. And there is a debate. I'm familiar with the debate. Some persons say, it's not bad. And people say sometimes who does the research will determine the outcome of the research. So what is your expert advice in an individual who says, I was advised that I should go the route of coconut oil rather than the other oils? What counsel do you have along those lines?
So coconut oil is in fact, it does have beneficial properties, such as those medium chain triglycerides, which are another type of fat. But what we want to look at, and what I encourage clients, is we never want to take any advice and apply it to ourselves wholesale. So even the advice that you're hearing from me here today, you're not going to just take this and just copy and paste it over your diet, because we don't know what conditions you have. So while coconut oil does contain those beneficial properties, for some persons who are struggling with managing their cholesterol, they find it really helpful to reduce that. So I have some persons who are vegan, vegetarian. They're not consuming animal products, but their cholesterol is still high. And when you speak to them, they use a lot of coconut oil, or they use a lot of the dried coconut, and they find it beneficial to remove that, and then the levels start going down a bit. So I think it is important, once again, don't just apply any advice wholesale to your life. You want to go and get that individualized counseling, those individualized recommendations when it comes to everything, including the coconut oil.
Okay, very well. I want to go back. I don't know if any of the other two of you want to add something to that. Okay.
I agree with Charity's recommendation.
All right. So now I want to ask, if my doctor says I have high cholesterol or I have a plaque buildup in my blood vessels, Well, I think Charity just mentioned that I should try to reduce, stay away from red meat, I'm going to say. What else do I do? I went to university. Some of my friends said, "Hey man, let's go out and eat." And we went to IHOP. They wanted to go to they're Americans. They wanted to go to IHOP. And when we got to IHOP, I realized that the menu wasn't for me, but I saw things with 5 eggs, 10 eggs. Is that okay? I mean, I always hear that eggs are very high in cholesterol. And I am wondering, why would somebody want to have 5 or 10 eggs in a single meal? Talk to me about that, please.
So the yolk of the egg is what would contain quite a bit of cholesterol. So I usually recommend that if person's cholesterol is very high, then they definitely want to remove those yolks, especially if they're having more than 1 yolk. However, for persons who have normal cholesterol, that may not be necessary. However, if you're going to be having more than 3-4 eggs per week, then you definitely want to start removing the yolk, which is what would contain the cholesterol. The whites are fine, you can enjoy your whites, excellent sources of protein. But what we want to, I think there has been this sort of egg fear, egg phobia when it comes to cholesterol. But persons are instead choosing to eat corned beef and sausages and the luncheon meats, which are also quite high in cholesterol. So, and they're processed, they have the salts and those other things. So if we have a balanced diet, I think that eggs definitely have a role to play. We just need to look at where your cholesterol levels are, how many eggs you're having at one time, and how often you're having those eggs. So we don't need to run away from eggs unless we're allergic to them.
Dr. Mid, I want to come back to you for a few minutes here, because as we look at treatment for heart disease, we're talking about heart disease.
Yes.
I've heard of various procedures such as angioplasty, triple bypass, and pacemakers, and you mentioned some of them in your opening remark, heart transplant and that kind of thing. When do I, should I say when? When do you do what? At what stage you have to do an angioplasty or you have to do triple bypass? What causes an individual to want a pacemaker as opposed to a heart transplant, etc.?
Right. Thank you for raising that. I don't think much persons understand these tests or investigations or surgeries. So I'll start with the angioplasty. Now, that would be to address the plumbing issue. So if it's someone who had a heart attack. Now, how do we determine the severity of the heart attack? When you experience a heart attack, we're looking first of all at a blood test called the troponin. If it's significantly elevated, we're thinking there's significant damage to the muscle, because once the heart muscles are not getting oxygenated blood, they essentially die. And if there's a complete blockage, we would know that there's a significant damage to the heart muscle, because it would have been an extended period without oxygenated blood getting to it. So the troponin is going to give an indicator of damage, muscle damage that's done. We're also going to move on to do your echocardiogram. That's an ultrasound of the heart. As I identified all the structures of the heart initially in the conversation, we are able to visualize the heart on the ultrasound machine. We see the heart moving. It's similar to seeing a baby on the ultrasound. I'm able to see the heart on the ultrasound. And I'll be looking at the left ventricle, because that's the main chamber that pushes blood with oxygen to the rest of the body. So I'll be looking for any abnormalities in the movement of the heart muscle. And if there is, we know that there was significant damage to the muscle. Patients then would come in for follow-up, and sometimes the pain settles with medications. But there are many patients who it doesn't settle. They're still having chest pain at the point of discharge. We try adjusting the medications to see if that would help. But If it's persistent, we move on to do what we call a coronary angiogram. And that's like, it means heart picture, image of the heart. And this, you get a dye. It's not available in Antigua at this time. I hope we do get it available here at some point. But most patients have to travel to get that procedure done at this time. It uses dye and it lights up the heart arteries on the screen. And we're looking to see if there's any obstruction to the blood flow. That's where the angioplasty comes in. And a stent is put in. So once a stent is used, we refer to it as an angioplasty. And the stent opens up the area where the blockage is to then allow the full flow of blood as prior to the blockage going there. So that's the angioplasty. And the pacemaker is used when the heart rate is extremely slow. So what's normal heart rate? 60 to 100. And usually the pacemaker is required if it's like between 30, 40 and going and less. So we won't be waiting for your heart rate to go less than 30, but patients do come into the office with those heart rates. You might feel dizzy, you may have actually fainted, generalized weakness are some of the symptoms patients might have. But on the ECG, we're looking for specific rhythms or specific patterns on the ECG, and that tells us the patient requires a pacemaker along with their symptoms. And so that's where the pacemaker comes in. So the pacemaker, the most common, well, one of the common reasons is what we call a complete heart block. So the upper chamber electrical system and the lower chamber electrical system, they're not in sync. The heart loves rhythm. It loves to be in sync. And so the upper chamber is beating on its own, and the lower chamber is beating on its own. Definitely not what the heart needs. And so we use the pacemaker to get it back into rhythm in terms of the contractions. You asked about the bypass. So,
before you go on to the bypass, so the pacemaker, it's something that is put into your body.
It's like a battery, yes.
And it uses battery.
And it has wires coming off of it. So if you think of your charger and the wires coming off the top of it, we place the wire to stimulate the heartbeat to get it back into rhythm. So the pacemaker itself is small, like the battery inside your cell phones. That's it's not a open heart sort of surgery. We enter via the veins. That's how we get access to the heart.
And how do you check to see when the battery needs to be changed?
Yes, so that I'm able to do at the office. It has a machine that reads the results of what's happening on the pacemaker. So it has a wand, and you place the wand over the pacemaker, and it extracts the information, and it comes up on the screen. This is done like every 6 months in terms of a routine check. So every 6 months, the patients are coming in for analysis of what's happening with the pacemaker. So most pacemakers last 10 to 12 years, and closer to like the 1 year, year and a half, we're monitoring extremely closely to determine if you need a new battery for the pacemaker. So some persons do need more than one, depending on when they place the initial one.
It just sounds a little scared, to be thinking that I'm dependent on something that is battery operated to determine life or death for me.
Once it's monitored closely, we are able to get it changed before it runs out. It's not gonna be 5 years and suddenly 1 year. No, but once you're getting those 6 months checks, we're able to get it changed in a timely manner.
Okay. So we can go on to the open heart surgery, the bypass, and that kind of thing.
All right. So bypass, what does that mean? That's really, I mentioned the angiogram before, and sometimes you do the angiogram. What could be found? None of the arteries could be blocked. So there are 3 main arteries that supply blood to the heart muscle with branches. So all of them have branches, but 3 main ones. And if we do the angiogram and we notice that there are 3 blockages, it's in a complicated place, It's pretty extremely long, longer than the stent could actually open. Bypass may be recommended. And so as you think of a detour, you're on the highway and there's a detour and you go around the other way. When you bypass, you place one of the arteries that they're going to extract from your body and bypass where that blockage is. So you get it from the good point, bypass where the blockage is and connect it lower down. And the heart is then able to get the blood supply that it needs when they do that. So that's what bypass means, but it is an open heart surgery. They're going to cut the chest and access the heart. The cardiac surgeons do that procedure. And ICU admissions is required after. But, you know, it's done in skilled hands. Experts do it. And so the risk is pretty low in those trained hands. And patients do well after these surgeries.
Now, again, and all of this is generally because of our lifestyle. That's what we're understanding. So somebody's asking a question or two here, and I want to put them out there. I think they're important questions. Let me just pull up the question. Arteries clogged by cholesterol reversible? This is what the individual is asking.
That's a very good question. Thank you. There's statins. So cholesterol medications, like we call them statins, they can limit the progression or the worsening of the plaque. And rosuvastatin, that's the medical name for it, it has shown some regression in the cholesterol levels. So it may not go back to 0%, but we do see reduction in the progression of the plaque, or it stabilizes that atherosclerosis process. Now, inflammation is a big part of heart attacks happening, and so the cholesterol medications help to settle that inflammatory process, and they also keep that cholesterol under control. The LDL, the bad cholesterol that we've been talking about, it lowers it to a range where it wouldn't increase your risk of heart attacks or strokes. So yes, that's one way to prevent it. And we did speak on what we're eating. So as Ms. Dublin mentioned, cholesterol in addition, we do get from what we eat, and the LDL comes from specific foods. If we avoid those foods, we're avoiding the LDL and build up in the arteries, and both of them work together to prevent progression. But we do get regression of the cholesterol or the plaque buildup from these statins. I get this a lot. It's usually challenging for patients to understand why they need the statins, because they've heard so many things about it negatively. But it is quite beneficial to prevent heart attacks and the recurrence of another heart attack or another stroke.
So is it safe to say that if I manage my diet well enough, let's say I am a vegetarian or a vegan, I exercise well, I stay away from saturated fats, that I will not get plaque buildup in my arteries?
Well, we would have to have started doing this from birth.
Uh-huh.
From birth, we would have to start doing it. Once we would have been having these products over time, over our lifetime. It's already laying down from the time we started consuming them. And, you know, but I would still encourage you, whenever you start, if you have to start now, let's start now. You will gain benefits from starting at this point.
In addition to that, Dr. Greene, if I should jump in here, when we think about diseases, we often have to put them in two categories. As we mentioned earlier, we are talking about congenital, something that you're born with, and secondly, acquired, something that you develop over time. And cholesterol, you do have some persons, the rare, so Dr. Mead was spot on in terms of the acquired, but some persons could have what you call hypercholesterolemia because there is a problem in their genetic code where you see some family members have high cholesterols, even though they have been eating well. You have persons who are vegans, vegetarians, they don't eat red meats, and they still find that the cholesterols are high. And no matter how much changes they make in their lifestyle, they notice that the cholesterol is still high. And so we attribute that to a genetic contribution to that cholesterol.
A very important point, but I'm assuming that would be a relatively small number of cases.
That's correct. But I actually did have someone a couple of years like that, slim, works out all the time, vegan, very, very impressive, a 30-something-year-old male. And when I asked him to go and trace his family history, he came back, asked about their medical history. Mother, father, uncle, aunts, many of them had cholesterol issues. We had done everything with him and nothing was working. So he ended up having to be on high dosage of cholesterol medications. Okay,
now there was another question that somebody asked that I think, and this is an interesting question. I believe Dr. Mead would want to respond to this. Can the size of the heart lead to heart disease?
All right. But I'm thinking they're mentioning it's enlarged. An enlargement in the heart. Yes, dilated cardiomyopathy, meaning an enlargement of the chambers of the heart, absolutely does lead to heart failure. It can lead to what we call a cardiomyopathy, meaning a disease of the muscle of the heart. And then there's enlargement in another way, where hypertension thickens the muscles of the heart. So how does it do that? I do like my comparison to familiar things to make things easier to understand. The lifting weights in the gym, if you think of the heart pushing against that high pressure in the artery, it's similar to lifting weights. The heart is a muscle. So similar to the biceps getting thickened and you know, we like to see that, thickened and muscled, increased bulk. It happens to the heart, but that's not the best, that's not a good situation for the heart. And we do have patients developing heart failure when that happens. And that's another reason why we stress the importance of managing hypertension appropriately, screening for hypertension. So you won't know what your blood pressure is unless you check the blood pressure. And so you want to routinely get your blood pressure checked, just so you know what it is. Hypertension does not cause symptoms. And so we call it the silent killer, actually, because it doesn't cause symptoms that will cause you to run and get your blood pressure checked. And yes, we may have heard of neck pain and the pressure being high. This really indicates it's been high for an extended period of time. And without a doubt, by the time you're checking it, it's going to be extremely elevated. So we encourage, again, get your screening done, get your blood pressure checked routinely.
Now, our time is slipping away, but there are several things that lead to heart disease: hypertension, diabetes, obesity, high cholesterol, and we can go on and on, smoking and all the rest of it and so on. What is the single most important contributor?
Single most contributor? Our very unhealthy diets. I would have identified as the single main contributor to heart disease.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes. So if we eat a very unhealthy diet or an unhealthy diet, it then leads to hypertension. It can lead to high cholesterol. It can lead to diabetes. And medical condition-wise, diabetes is the main risk factor for a heart attack. So diabetics are 2 to 3 times at risk for a heart attack compared to a non-diabetic. But the root problem is our poor nutrition. and it then leads to all the other major risk factors for heart disease. We're also not managing stress well. Our poor management of stress is also a major problem.
So I want to just go back quickly to something we mentioned last week, because if diet is so significant and we have an issue, we said last week, Ms. Dublin mentioned it today, eating healthy is expensive. And I really want to speak to the whole idea of what, I know we have to take personal responsibility, but what are the authorities doing with respect to why is it that all the affordable things in the supermarkets are unhealthy and the healthy things are so expensive? Should not we be putting systems in place, rules, regulations, force people to eat healthy, so to speak? I can go and buy some soda, some sugary drink, those are very affordable. But when I want to get something healthy, it costs a lot. And at the end of the day, it is also impacting on the revenues for the government, the hospital services, the medical services. And when you have all these individuals, and if we know that heart disease, as you mentioned, Dr. Mead, is the #1 killer in Antigua, Barbuda, and in the world, then that should say something to us. We have all these franchises that are selling things that are not contributing to our well-being. So where do we draw the line? What are some recommendations that, as nutritionists and cardiologists and family doctors and so on, what are some recommendations that you can make? Now I asked the question already. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do believe we have a crisis on our hand.
Yes, we do. We absolutely do. It's quite concerning. And when we consider the expense. Now, we spoke about the bypass surgery, that's upwards of $50,000 for bypass surgery. And getting a stent can be $20,000 if you require a stent. And so if we're thinking of expenses, we need to invest now in the healthier foods. Because once you're sick, you need to go to the doctor, you need medications, you need investigations, you need sometimes hospital admission, and then these very costly procedures and surgeries. And so we want to look at it from that perspective. But policies, the Heart and Stroke Foundation, I'm not sure if you heard about it, but we are working and we will be encouraging, advising the government. The Ministry of Health should also be doing that. But we really, really need to put the work in if we're going to be seeing changes. We've started with our children. I highlighted the children from before. If we're going to make changes, we have to start from a young age. I mean, resounding changes with these concerning trends. We have to start with the children before they get all with these poor diets. You mentioned how you grew up and what the family was eating. So we want to change that mindset. Let this be the new culture or new Antiguan culture of eating, because the food is really what is affecting us and what is killing us slowly, if we're going to be very blunt about it.
Now we have 1 minute, but the Seventh Adventist Church advocates what we call a lacto-ovo vegetarian lifestyle. So when we have functions, we do not serve flesh. We encourage healthy eating, but we do get a lot of pushback. We do get people saying, I can't eat this, I can't eat that, etc. Now, as a pastor, somebody who is responsible for enforcing the policies, etc., you hear, people grumble, I don't want to come to luncheon because we don't have any meat and that kind of thing. As a cardiologist, and Dr. Mead, I'm asking you this, as a cardiologist, do you think, I'm not sure if you were aware of what I just said, but do you think that that's a good policy? And for people who push back against it, what would you say to them?
So there's no fish either.
We advocate lacto-ovo vegetarian lifestyle. So that's what we encourage. Of course, we don't say that people can't use something else. That's their choice. But if it's a church-sponsored program, in terms of what we supply as food, we go plant-based. Let's put it that way.
Right. So the cardiac associations that we do research that give us the guidelines in terms of managing patients with heart disease, we have not moved away from having fish and poultry. So, but what we do emphasize is quarter of the dinner plate can be peas and beans, fish and poultry. But 50% should be vegetables, non-starchy vegetables and fruits. And so that's the guidelines from the cardiac societies. And the remaining quarter, based on your other underlying medical conditions. So this is the general eating plate. Not diabetic, you're not hypertensive, and you're not having high cholesterol. You are allowed the remaining quarter of the plate, brown rice and whole grain pasta, are allowed in that. So moderation and portion sizes is what's encouraged from the cardiac societies.
I'm sorry that our time is up, because I wanted to go to the poultry thing. I'm going to steal a minute here.
Yeah.
Because I'm aware that, I was attending this function a few years ago, Ministry of Agriculture, and one of the presenters was saying, listen, if you're going to eat chicken, you're better off eating your homegrown chicken, because much of what we're getting are 6-week-old chickens that are packed with hormones and that they're impacting our people. So a lot of times, even what quote unquote is supposed to be safe, because of the production rush for money, we are getting things that are not helping us out.
Right, so that negates it. Yes, you don't want the poultry that's gotten a lot of hormones and no. Without it. Yes, so I understand that. So that's another matter. So once we say that, then there's always a but and a if. So we could talk about this all day, actually. But as natural is best. And honestly, within my practice and reading and educating further, less meat, if we're going to remove meat, that might be where we're going. Because when we talk about the fish, then we're talking about mercury, and the fish contaminated with mercury. So plant-based is actually the better overall.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up. I am so grateful. I have another meeting right now, but I'm so grateful for the information that you presented. We could say a lot more. There were 1 or 2 areas that we didn't get to touch, but that is the nature of how things are. But Dr. Mead, we want to express gratitude to you and to Ms. Dublin and Dr. Stevens for sharing with us this afternoon. Next week, friends, listeners, we are going to be wrapping up I'm saying tentatively, we're going to be wrapping up our discussions on NCDs. Next week, we hope to be going back to the issue. There were so many appeals for us to continue to talk about the whole issue of obesity, and especially as it relates to the children. So we want to kind of revisit that. Hopefully next week, I'm saying hopefully next week, we will do that. But there's so many other things. I had a listener from Trinidad who sent me quite a bit of information, reaction to last week's program on issues relating to whether we shouldn't be looking to safe schools in terms of health, and whether our schooling system should not be geared towards changing. Dr. Mead, you kind of mentioned, changing the concept and giving people an orientation that can positively impact them later on. And I didn't get a chance to follow through with what you're saying. if at 25 or 40, I now learn that, my lifestyle with cholesterol was bad and I make the change, I've already done some damage. And so if I start early, it's better for me. But our time is up. So there's a lot more that we can explore. Thank you all so much. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Yes. So friends, that's all the time we have. We went over by 5 minutes, but you do understand. We look forward to seeing you next week for another edition of Let's Talk. God bless.